This training is also drawing on Gates' recently published crisis communication toolkit called Turning the Tide, a toolkit to combat anti-gender extremism. So I'm taking the liberty to share also this link in the chat. And I highly recommend you have a look and that you also learn more from this toolkit. That will be all for me. Again, I'm very happy to see all your faces, a lot of familiar names and non-familiar name. We are 62 in the place, and Hannah, the mic is yours.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Anwar. And thank you really for everyone who is here. It was exciting that there were so many RSVPs and so much interest in this. And I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and having a bit of discussion at the end. So as Anwar said, please do add your questions into the chat, and we'll make sure that we get to as many as we can at the end of the conversation. So really pleased to be able to talk about both strategic communications and crisis communications today. We'll talk a little bit about the difference between the two, at least how I see it. But I will just share a little bit about my background. So I live in Orlando, Florida, in the States, and I've worked in the LGBTQ political movement and reproductive justice movement here in Florida at the national level in the States, and beginning to make deeper relationships across the globe as well, and being able to work with GATE and other partners who work globally. And so these are my sort of recommendations, best practices from my vantage point. You all know your context, your work better than I ever could. And I really do hope that you will take all of this through your own filter of your own expertise, apply what you think will make sense, and also feel free, please, to innovate and experiment with these recommendations and see how they align with you and your particular work. I get really excited about persuasive communications and building a world where every single person is safe and valued for exactly who they are. And I think that part of that has been figuring out how we can communicate our stories and our expertise clearly, compellingly, and really use the power of the spoken word, the written word as well, to build the kind of coalitions we need to make the world the safer and more just place that we all are working every day to create. So as Anwar said, let me see if this works. There we go. So when I developed my own business, I thought a lot about what I wanted to call it. And I decided to call it Heart Forward Consulting, because I really do believe that heart forward and heart fueled movements is what will carry the day and what will create the, as I said, the safe and just and equitable world that we're all working to create. And so when it comes to persuasive and strategic and crisis communications of all kinds, I'm always trying to think for myself and for the people I work with, encourage more and more emotion, more and more personal connection. And if you can speak with the message of your heart, that is really always going to be the most compelling strategy, in my opinion. So a little bit about the difference between strategic communications and crisis communications. So when I think of strategic communications, what I think of is a more proactive, ongoing series of strategies that's about reaching towards our key audiences, seeking to understand and be understood. So we'll talk about this a little bit later, but always wanting to be really, really specific about creating communication strategies that maximize our chances of being understood. If we say the most compelling things, share all of the really important arguments, make all of the really important statistical cases for our work, but it's said in a way that can't be understood by our audience, well, then we really haven't been able to communicate effectively, right? So a lot of the recommendations you'll hear today are about orienting ourselves towards our audiences and being as specific as possible about who they are. Creating cognitive dissonance, to me, is about allowing our audience and encouraging our audience to question their own certainty about a particular issue. So in this instance, we know that anti-gender extremists have been very, very, very effective at spreading myths and lies and misconceptions about who transgender and gender diverse people are, who women are, who lesbian and gay and bisexual people are, people with disabilities, lots of communities, right? And when we create cognitive dissonance, what we're doing is we're creating a question, a less certainty in our audience about believing what anti-gender extremists have said about us, and poking holes in those arguments by asking good questions and sharing more personal perspectives. So that's what I mean by cognitive dissonance. Making space for our stories, as we already have said. You'll hear me say this probably several times during this training, but I'm always trying to think about an open heart, strong spine balance in communications work. So how can I have an open heart, lead with my emotion, my desire to connect, but I still have my strong spine and my principled and my boundaries? And always, when in doubt, be a human being. So strategic communications is really about connecting person to person. When it comes to crisis communications, this is about rapid response to emergencies. So strategic communications, ongoing, proactive, something that can be used, these tactics in all contexts all the time. Crisis communications is very particular tips and strategies for the unexpected, and usually for the negatively unexpected. So when I began working with GATE, it was in response to when the United Nations Special Rapporteur, Reem, was attacking the organization and spreading, again, a lot of myths and misconceptions and attacking the credibility of the organization. Has done this to lots of organizations and lots of individuals. And there's been other actors as well who have done these similar tactics. That is a crisis communication scenario, because what we need to do is assess whether, how, when, and to whom we respond. What we will want to do, of course, is prioritize our overarching goals as opposed to our immediate reactions in a crisis communication scenario. So the primary reason why we'll spend some time on the strategic communications front is because in crisis, our response is always stronger when we have spent time investing in a proactive strategy and not just responding to crisis after crisis, emergency to emergency. So persuasive messaging, if I'm trying to build a public education campaign about the needs of trans and gender diverse people in a particular country context or across the globe, there's a lot of different ways to do that. And I know there's been lots of conversations across all movements about message testing and messaging research and all of that. That changes over time, it evolves over time. But when I think of persuasive messaging, I think less about the words being used for myself, because those can change over time, and more about the posture, more about the position of the messenger when it comes to using sort of helpful messaging or unhelpful. So when I think of good messaging, I think of walking over to my audience, taking their hand, and taking a step with them. So that is in contrast to unhelpful messaging, which is shouting at someone from across the room that they're wrong and you're right, or speaking in a way that they can't understand, ignoring where they are coming from initially. So when we think about persuasion, it's always better to lean towards, to reach towards our audience, walk over to them and really bring them with us, as opposed to from a distance. We'll talk about name calling later too, but it's very tempting And if we want to be persuasive, there are just some really good reasons for being more inviting in the language that we use when trying to persuade. There's other goals where we might take different tactics, but when we're trying to persuade, reaching towards is really the best strategy. So again, this is a just a restatement of walking over to someone and taking a step with them versus shouting at them or speaking in a way that they can't understand. So we won't spend too long on this because I know there's been we've all been to lots of conversations, or many of us, perhaps not all, have been in conversations about the movable middle, conflicted middle. Some people call this group the winnable middle now. I like to think of the spectrum of humanity. There's lots of different spectrums of humanity. And one of them is about our audiences. So later, when we talk about crisis communications specifically, I'll encourage you to really think about assessing your various audiences and being really thoughtful about who the different people are that you as an advocate or as an organization are addressing, speaking to, engaging with in your work. So when we do our work as advocates, we are often speaking to people who are very solidly in support of the work that we do. People who are with us 100%, who are perhaps our volunteers or our community members, folks who are never going to change their mind about the need for trans and gender diverse liberation, equality, and humanity, really. So these are strong allies. They understand the issues, they're committed, and they're not moving. I am grateful that we have these people, right? The other folks on the other opposite side are people that we engage with a lot less often. At least I think, it's not common for us to be constantly doing our work with people who are strongly opposed, do not have any room for coming to understand who we are, and therefore are not worth our time. Unfortunately, we all have some family members in that category, right? Or there are, of course, elected leaders and people that we are navigating who fall into this category. When we go to meet with elected leaders or members of parliament or the United Nations, sometimes we are, in fact, engaging these people. But the vast majority of folks that we engage fall under this central category of the conflicted middle. And I like to describe them as the conflicted middle because it helps me to remember that these are people who hold opposing views simultaneously. They really, really believe that they are good people who are fair-minded, who, don't want anyone to be harmed. But at the same time, they're really susceptible to anti-gender extremist messaging, to opposition messaging. These are people who might say things like, oh no, I definitely don't want anyone to be kicked out of their home for being transgender or to experience violence. Oh, absolutely not. I want people to be safe. But I'm not so sure about this sports issue. I'm a little nervous about bathrooms. I don't know about healthcare for children. So these are people who are conflicted. They have different opinions simultaneously. And what I find helpful about the word conflicted too, and the way that this is structured, is just a reminder that there are people inside of our own movements who are also conflicted. We know in the broader LGBTQ framework, especially, but even in women's movements, feminist spaces, politically progressive spaces, there are people who hold conflicting views about trans and gender diverse people. So for me, when I think about strategic communications, I like to think of conflicted middle until proven otherwise. It's helpful for me to assume that my audiences are conflicted unless I am 100% certain that they fall into one of the other two categories. So the conflicted middle is a group of people who don't often think they know anyone who's trans or gender diverse. They lack familiarity with this community, and they just don't have the full understanding that we would like them to have about our stories, our humanity, and our experiences in our lives. So just in summary, these are people who want to be good people. They believe that they are fair and kind. They believe discrimination and violence and harassment are wrong, but they don't have a clear picture in their heads of who trans and gender diverse people are and what our communities experience every day, which leaves them susceptible to fear-mongering and the opponent's messaging, the anti-gender messaging. So that leaves them vulnerable to what we don't want them to hear and what we don't want them to be compelled by. And it, excuse me, it was just a loud noise. And that means that they are also vulnerable to our compelling messages by being vulnerable, empathetic, and heart forward in our persuasive communications as well. So one of the ways that we can connect with people who are in the conflicted middle is to normalize unfamiliarity. This is difficult for a number of reasons. And like I said, this is not something that we need to do with everyone per se, but when I think about across issues, the dynamics that have existed in political spaces, especially in the last several years, where we have decided that someone's personal evolution is shameful, or that we aren't encouraging or accepting people who change their minds to the same degree. This is not the case overall, but it seems as though we are holding people to a higher and higher standard about always having been with us the whole time and never changing their minds or evolving. Now, I have definitely changed my mind about a whole lot of issues, a whole lot of things, because you can't know what you don't know. This is not to suggest that we ever excuse dehumanizing language, violent rhetoric, or people who would cause us harm. It's not at all the suggestion. But I do believe that people can come to change their perspectives on a variety of issues. And when we normalize the journey, when we normalize changing our minds, it creates a lot of space and permission for people to come to different conclusions. So even just saying, it can be hard to understand what it means to be queer in my case, or trans or gender diverse, especially if you've never met someone in this community. I understand that it can be new. It can feel complex. You may have questions or not be sure if you're doing or saying the right thing. Just by naming that, we do create a lot of permission for people to evolve and change their minds, as I said. And in the conflicted middle, one of the things that we know is that people are very nervous about saying or doing the wrong thing, and it can lead them to be overly susceptible to the anti-gender extremists who want to pull us apart. And they do it very successfully, unfortunately. So this is a framework that I've used in the past for developing talking points, developing messages. So when we think about both strategic communications and crisis communications, one of the things that is tricky is figuring out what to say. What exactly do we say on social media? What exactly do we say in an email or blog post to our allies? What exactly do we say if we need to speak to a reporter or we are speaking at a press conference? This formula has been very helpful to me because particularly in emergency situations and rapid response moments, it is really easy to get overwhelmed. When I simplify things for myself in moments of crisis, when I have a formula I can reach for, it's helpful to my overwhelmed brain. And on a proactive level, when I'm developing communication strategies more proactively, having this kind of formulaic approach can also be helpful to simplify because we're all really busy and none of us have time to reinvent the wheel over and over. So this strategy encourages us to lead with values. So one of the things around the work we do is we're all doing this work because we care a lot about creating a safer, more equitable, more just world for trans and gender diverse people. We have values that drive our work. These values may be different person to person, and a lot of us have a lot of values in common with each other and a lot of values in common with audiences that we want to bring closer to us, that we wish were more aligned with our work. These are values like safety, freedom, authenticity, wanting to be able to go about our lives being authentically ourselves, opportunity for all, making as many opportunities for people to live beautiful lives, being free to participate in our communities without fear. These might seem really basic, but all of us have core motivating factors that drive us in this advocacy work. And a lot of them are similar to what drive other folks in their everyday lives too. So when we start with values, we're able to connect right off the bat. I like to also say that it's easier to create a message that the first thing you say is the hardest to disagree with. So when we connect with values first, then we move into substance. Moving into substance can be the actual meat of what it is that you're trying to communicate. We'll talk about some bridge phrases later, but we're just moving up the pyramid now. Bridge phrases are more almost like word, what's the word? It's like a word trick or like a shortcut to help people move from the very substantive arguments that they're making and back to a more aspirational message as well. So when we end with aspiration, we're also ending with something that is, again, difficult to disagree with, easy to connect with. So this is the formula, as I said, connecting with values first, and we have an example on the next slide, so don't worry. Connecting with values first, substance second, a bridge phrase third, and then a visionary, aspirational closing statement at the end. So the structure here is also aligned with this really philosophy that the first thing presented is always best remembered. I would not have thought this. This was very surprising to me when I learned this. I would have thought that the last thing you say is the thing people most remember, but it's not the case. What we say first is most remembered. At the very end, that's second in terms of reasonably well remembered. And all the stuff in the middle is the least well remembered. So that means that we want to say the most important thing right away. So when you're writing a speech, the first line is incredibly important. We don't want to save the good stuff for the very end. We actually want to start from the very beginning with our strongest arguments. It also means when we're creating a talking point, when we're creating a message, we want to lead with values, like we said on this previous slide, because that's what people will take away. That's what people will really remember. And then that second piece, being the visionary closing statement, people will also really remember that. So here's an example. First off, we all want everyone to have access to the best possible healthcare. I know that this may not feel true about everyone, but again, we're not talking about our opposition. We're not talking about strongly opposed people. We're talking about average, everyday people who would say, well, yeah, absolutely. I want everyone to have good healthcare. I want everyone to be healthy. Secondly, we move into the substance. Interestingly enough, there's a lot of scientific evidence that shows when people can make their own decisions about their health, when they have the knowledge, they can make better decisions, which leads to better health outcomes. So we've got our argument here. We're talking about scientific evidence. We're talking about research showing that when people have the knowledge themselves, when they can make their own decisions, that ends up that they have better health outcomes, that they are healthier. And that's why, that's our bridge phrase, we are advocating for trans and gender diverse people to be able to access the healthcare we need to be able to live full, happy, and healthy lives. So this is just one example, but you can see that what we're starting with, big picture at the beginning and big picture at the end. The substance in the middle is very important, but we're sandwiching it, right, in between things that are very difficult to disagree with. That's intentional. And at the end, we're casting a picture. We're helping people imagine the world in which people are able to make their own decisions, access the healthcare they need, and live those full, happy, and healthy lives. One of the things that's tricky is that in our movements, and I think this is a challenge on the political left broadly in progressive spaces, we do have the facts on our side. We do. And we have all of the statistics and research, many of the statistics and research we need to prove those points. And arguments around statistics and facts are not as compelling as I wish they were. They just don't carry the day as strongly as emotion, as values, as human connection and stories, which is why we see that our opposition often shares things that are not true, often shares research that has been debunked, often shares really, really faulty scientific, so-called scientific evidence, but they use emotion to generate fear. And that is why they are able to build successful movements. I want to build movements based on hope, based on connection, and based on a shared sense of our humanity. So what we can do is, of course, share the very important research and data that we have that backs up our arguments. But when we're thoughtful about doing so, when we do so in ways that are still emotionally compelling, sandwiching our research between values and between aspirational visionary statements, we are able to create more compelling messages, more compelling communications, and we're able to do so in a way that more directly addresses how anti-gender extremists are building their movements. So we're still using emotion to be compelling in ways that are important, but also ethical, I think, far more so. And, leaning on that strategy and not just allowing our opposition to be the ones talking about emotion and we are the ones only talking about facts. That's an oversimplification, but I do think it's important to be honest about the fact that we have the facts on our side, but we still need to be connecting with people's hearts. So just quickly, this point is, there's various types of communications that you'll do. This is a quick series of tips around public speaking itself. Any context, speaking at a rally, speaking on a stage, speaking one-on-one with a member of parliament or, important person in your community, but also speaking on, media interviews and other things like that. These are tips designed to just help you once you've settled what you're going to say. This helps address how to say it. So our body language is very, very important. And it's often far more important than what we actually say. So we spend all this time coming up with messages, and we just went through how to develop good messages. But it's also really important to make sure that we're communicating them in ways that are also compelling. So experts estimate that up to 55% of all human communication is nonverbal, 38% is tone of voice. That leaves very little for what it is that we actually say, which is why it's so important that we have a sense of awareness, a sense of practicing the actual communication itself. So visual, verbal, and vocal are really the three aspects of communication: visual, body language, and facial expressions. So you may have seen in the last 40 minutes, my eyebrows move a lot when I speak. I use my hands a lot when I speak. That's all good. It's also very distracting. If I were to be doing a media interview right now, you would not be seeing my hands move. I would be trying to keep my face a bit more calm and controlled. When we're doing public speaking in more broad spaces, using hand gestures is really helpful, but we want to try to use them in more, circular or right angles, as opposed to, I've already done this a few times. It's fine in a more casual context like this, but it can be distracting in more professional or public spaces. Vocal is about our voice. So pitch, rate, tone, volume. These are all different aspects of our actual vocal communication. When we are using our volume or our speed, for example, to deliver a really important point, we are allowing people to receive our voices in ways that are most like assertive and compelling. The third piece is actually the messaging content and talking points itself. So as I said, open heart, strong spine, that's definitely my strategy when I'm doing public communications of any kind. The open heart is about using emotional connections. So I think facial expressions are a really important way to generate human connection. And then also, of course, the idea of the strong spine is that I know what I'm here to say. I know what I'm here to communicate, and I'm not going to take any crap. I still have my points that I want to make and my principles, even while I'm trying to connect. I'm not going to allow any dehumanizing rhetoric or any insulting rhetoric. I can still hold my own. Embodying punctuation to me means using my voice and my body to land the plane, to make my arguments really connect with my audience. So one of the things that you can do is to use your voice, use your hand gestures to make the points you want to make. So what I just did was I started with my hands out here. I slowed my speech. I used pauses, and I ended on a low tone. Those are those nonverbal cues to the audience that I just said something important. Another thing I love to do is pause before making a really important point. So if we go back to this winning message here, if we're practicing, we can say, we all want everyone to have access to the best possible healthcare. And interestingly enough, there is a lot of scientific evidence that shows when people can make their own decisions about their health, they make better decisions, which leads to better health outcomes. And that's why we are advocating for trans and gender diverse people to be able to access the healthcare we need to be able to live full, happy, and healthy lives. So we're using gestures, using the tone of voice to really get that last sentence to land with our audience. So it's just about weaving together the actual delivery with the messages that we create. One other thing that can be really helpful, especially in crisis communications, is learning how to answer tough questions in a way that helps you pivot back to your primary message. So ABC is very, English style of tips and, a way to remember it. But when we're asked a tough question, one of the very best things to keep in mind is to remember that we can lean towards a person who asks the question by agreeing with some part of what they've just asked, meeting them where they are, and extending towards them, normalizing that it's okay to have questions, normalizing that people are curious, people are concerned. It's very important to note here that we can validate that people have concerns without validating the concerns themselves. So if you receive a question about transgender girls participating in sports, and is it really fair? Is it really safe? For example, we don't need to validate the particular concerns about fairness or about safety in order to still say, I hear that question a lot, or a lot of people have that concern. What that does is it just normalizes the idea that people are curious, people have questions, people have concerns. We don't need to say it's okay to have those concerns, but validating the existence of them means that our audience is going to be more available to hear the bridge phrase, which I've listed some examples. The good news is that's why in this case, at the end of the day, and then we move back to our point, the convince and conclude at the very end, which is when we deliver our winning message, we deliver the point, and we redirect the conversation back to where we would like the conversation to exist. So when we validate that people have those concerns, even if the question is asked in bad faith, we can still extend towards other listeners who may feel that they have genuine questions and concerns. So for example, when we're communicating in a crisis communications scenario, the particular bad actor, the particular person who has attacked us or our organization, they are not our audience. It's everybody else who might be listening or observing or waiting for our reaction. Those are the people I want to keep in mind. And those are people who may relate to some of the questions or concerns that have been raised. And when we dismiss all, when we imply that it's somehow wrong or bad to have questions, we might lose those people. And we didn't need to lose them because it's as simple as agreeing with some part of the concern. We can say something like, if people are attacking, the WPATH standards or attacking access to just basic access to healthcare for trans folks, and are concerned, well, is this really, safe? Is this really effective? Is this really, okay for children to access, for example? It's really hard to not react to that kind of a question with anger, with frustration. Our work has been so skewed by anti-gender extremists. It's very frustrating that we are having conversations about access to basic healthcare. But inside of that question is a concern for safety. It's a concern for well-being. It's a concern for health. So imagine answering that question with, I hear your concern. I'm also really concerned about the safety, health, and well-being of all people, including trans and gender diverse people. And that's why I am so passionate about ensuring that trans and gender diverse people can access the basic life-saving healthcare they need. When people have the information, the knowledge themselves to make their own health decisions, it leads to better health outcomes. And that's why I'm advocating for access, for greater education, for greater funding for whatever it is that you're advocating for. And we've gotten back to our point, to our message, while still saying, yeah, I understand the concern for health and well-being. And here's what I'm doing with my concern for health and well-being. We might be reaching different conclusions. And this is not something you need to do in every context, but in particular, when you have people in the room or listening to the news at home who may share some of those concerns, we want to speak in a way that doesn't turn them off and still allows them to have questions while very authoritatively redirecting them to the truth, redirecting them to our point. So when it comes to crisis communications in particular, this is tough stuff. And one of the things I want to just make sure that we say is that if you or your organization are attacked or facing an emergency, facing a crisis of, this bill just got introduced, or this resource center has shut down, or this person at the United Nations is saying terrible things. It can be a number of different crises. And I know that every single person in this Zoom and who will be listening later has had to deal with various crises, probably this morning, probably yesterday. It's happening all the time. A lot of my work is very trauma focused. So I really desire to do this work in a way that is trauma informed. And the reason is that when we face crises and we are people who ourselves have experienced trauma, it can exacerbate, it can escalate our reactions to crises because we've already experienced so much as individual people. And so that can lead to raw, volatile, and emotional reactions to crises. That's very natural. And it's very important that you feel safe enough to share those reactions with your team or your loved ones or those close to you. It's very understandable when we feel like we are constantly being attacked to react strongly and in a volatile way to yet another attack. And it's important to pause before responding externally from that place. Public responses can almost always wait, and allowing that pause to give your body and your brain a moment to come down from any trauma response that may have been triggered upon hearing of the attack is really important, to give your brain some space to let your body relax outside of the escalation, outside of the strong response to the attack itself. We talked before about assessing audiences. So this is something that we can do outside of a crisis. You could do now. Sit and think about who are the various groups of people that you're interacting with as an individual advocate or as an organization. And that can be done outside of a crisis timeline, where you analyze all of the internal and external groups. So maybe staff, maybe board members, maybe donors or foundations, key organizational partners, influential stakeholders, any of your particular members or fellow community members. These are people that can be reached in a lot of different ways. You can reach them by email, by social media, or through the press, through the formal media. But all of those different groups and all of those different mechanisms require different responses. You may decide some of those groups never need a response for a particular crisis. You may never post on social media in response to an emergency. It's really important that we do that assessment of audiences in a moment of calm, because when the crisis has happened, it can just be that much more overwhelming to do. public statements are not the only way to respond, and they're often not the most strategic way to respond. So thinking about those various audiences as distinct from the general public. The general public is an audience that may not require any response, or let alone an immediate one. And as I alluded to before, some bad actors, some people that are just attacking in bad faith, they might not deserve any public response, and there might be official channels where you can file a formal complaint or seek some sort of remedy. And we often think the media needs an immediate response. I don't think the media often needs an absolute immediate response. And waiting a few beats, a few hours, a few days to be able to allow your body and brain to come back down so that you can think more strategically is really, really important. When you do respond, don't underestimate the power of personal stories and human emotion. Focusing on the emotional impact of these attacks will help members of the general public connect with trans and gender diverse people in a deeper way, and provides an opportunity for them to hear your unique expertise and your unique perspectives of those who are most impacted. A lot of these crises moments, it's very tempting to get into an argument over the facts. Well, they said this, I say this, they're wrong about that, I'm right about this. There's a time and a place for that, but arguing over the facts will always be far less powerful than responding with emotion that really contextualizes the real human impact. And I always think of an opportunity to counteract that flawed mental template that folks have by responding with vulnerability, with authenticity, with empathy. I trained someone, did some media training with someone who had a really hard time staying calm during moments when she would be asked really hostile questions, and had a difficult time not reacting and wanting to correct and bring anger and bring the better facts and the better statistics and the better data. And what we worked on together was that she practiced pausing and saying, when she would hear a very dehumanizing question about the trans folks that she was working with and representing, she would just pause and say, it's really difficult for me to hear you speak that way about people I love and my community, people I work with. I'll just need a minute to collect myself before I respond. And when she did that, it was like everyone in the room was leaned in, waiting to hear what she would say next. And sometimes as advocates, we think we need to come from a position of always strong, always certain, never weak, never emotional. The work we do is highly emotional. And when we respond with emotion, it can actually be really counterintuitively powerful, that in such a way that really allows our audience to see the real impact of these attacks on real human beings, and in a way that actually can be even more compelling. As I said, there's a place for facts, and we can respond with real arguments, and we should, but we shouldn't underestimate that power of human connection, even if it's, I'm afraid, I'm nervous, I'm angry. Responding with that, once you've given yourself time to come back down, can be really, really powerful. Also, when it comes to crisis communications, here in the US, we talk about the North Star. You may talk about the Southern Cross, depending on where you are in the world. But crisis communications is still best conceived of when we are always responding in a way that still gets us to our big picture goal. So we don't want to be pulled off of our goals when we are responding to emergencies. This is very difficult because when we are constantly putting out fires left and right all the time, it's very difficult to stay focused on our overarching North Star, Southern Cross goals. But it's really important, particularly in the work that you all do. There are enough crises to go around, but your work is too important to be pulled in all of these different directions. And there's a way to respond to emergencies that still gets us towards our overarching goal. And that's often through communications in a way that is using our messages, using our stories and our expertise, and still speaking about what we want to be, what we want the conversation to be about. So, for example, we talked about the ABCs of tough questions. Responding to crisis means addressing what's in front of us. We can't ignore it. But how can we use a bridge phrase to get back to the point we want, the conversation we wish we were having, to pivot, right? I didn't mention this before, but we do want to avoid the word but in the bridge phrases because it negates what we've just done by reaching towards and agreeing with our audience in some way or the question asker in some way. But we can still get back to our safe terrain, and we should. And that's what I mean by staying focused on the North Star of our work, even when we are responding to crisis. We can still do so in a way that, helps us get back to the work at hand. Avoiding name calling, it's really hard. And I want to say really clearly, it is not for this, it's not for the sake of the person who has done us harm that we avoid name calling. I don't avoid name calling to do them any favors. The reason I suggest this is because of the other audiences who are watching and listening to our responses, to the people who may have, as we said before, their own questions, their own curiosities, their own concerns. They don't wish us harm, but they don't see how the anti-gender extremists are causing us harm. When we call out the extremists in ways that we call them bigots, or we call them haters, or we call them monsters, which they may very well be, we are communicating to the other folks who may have questions that we also feel that way about them unintentionally. So again, this is not for the sake of the people who have done us harm. It's for the sake of building opportunities for other people to see that they can connect with our work. They can bring their questions, but they can still evolve and change their minds and come to see the humanity of our communities. Going forward, outside of a crisis communications moment, finding opportunities to stay proactive instead of just reactive. So we can always consider how to proactively assert the narrative we prefer. But one of the best ways to do this is through ongoing proactive first-person storytelling so that members of our communities can share their experiences and their expertise in their own words. When we have these crisis communications moments, it's always going to go better when we've got that proactive stuff to look back on and lean on, the foundation that we have the chance to build right now outside of an emergency. And then lastly, and most importantly, actually, considering the physical safety and well-being of everyone impacted. So this requires really concrete resource allocation and making a plan now for what is possible if someone in your organization, a colleague or a staff member of yours, has been the victim of cyber harassment or doxing. But clarifying any policies or support you can find now to prepare for those potential crises is really important. GATE does offer some organizational development resources to be able to help you think these questions through and think about how to mitigate potential harm. And there are some other resources in the toolkit as well that Anwar shared before, the Turning the Tide toolkit. If someone has been a victim of cyber harassment or doxing or physical violence as well, consulting with them about what they want and need, and then as an organization communicating that out on their behalf so that they are not holding the additional burden of communicating and negotiating with all these various people can be a helpful and concrete way to support. So as I said, that Turning the Tide toolkit, which is in the chat, at the very top of the chat, I've seen that it's been a very active chat. But that is all the way at the top, and Anwar can, I'm sure, share that link again. So now we have some time for questions and reflections. And as I said at the beginning, I'm really, really curious whether you've already tried some of these tactics in the past, how it's gone, whether it's gone well, whether you have had unexpected challenges and how you have navigated that. And then also just any specific questions you might have for me or for the team at Gate. Really interested in catching up on the chat as well.
Thank you so much, Hannah. It was indeed. Thank you so much, everyone. Everyone seemed to be very enthusiastic about the training. So 10 across board, I guess. Thank you so much, everyone.